Prince Alexander stood at the grand window of Raven's Hollow Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the ancient grounds of the Kingdom of Valdoria. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet dignity expected of the heir to the throne, but today something troubled him deeply. In his hand, he clutched a leather folder containing documents that would shake the very foundation of the monarchy. The discovery had been entirely accidental. 3 days earlier, while searching through his late mother's private study for her personal diary, something his father, King Edmund, had requested for the upcoming memorial service, Alexander had stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind an ornate bookshelf. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about his stepmother, Queen Duchess Isabella. Isabella had married his father 5 years after Queen Margaret's tragic death in a riding accident. At the time, the kingdom had welcomed the union. Isabella, a widow herself from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, had seemed like the perfect companion for the grieving king. She was elegant, intelligent, and had quickly won over both the court and the people with her charitable works and gracious manner. But the documents Alexander now possessed told a different story entirely. As he reviewed the papers again, his hands trembled slightly. The first document was a contract, written in Isabella's distinctive handwriting and signed with her personal seal. It outlined a detailed plan to gradually transfer significant portions of Valdoria's treasury to secret accounts in Astoria. The amounts were staggering, enough to fund a small army or destabilize an entire economy. The second document was even more damning. It was a letter addressed to someone identified only as Lord Blackthorn, discussing the strategic placement of Astorian loyalists in key positions within Valdoria's government. Isabella had been systematically infiltrating their kingdom's most sensitive departments: the treasury, the military command, and even the royal guard. Alexander's mind raced as he considered the implications. His stepmother wasn't just the queen consort. She was potentially a spy, working to weaken Valdoria from within. But for what purpose? Was this an elaborate plot to merge the kingdoms under Astorian rule? Or something even more sinister? The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted his thoughts. Alexander quickly secured the documents in his jacket pocket as the door opened. His younger sister, Princess Sophia, entered with her characteristic burst of energy. "Alexander, there you are," she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed from her morning ride. "Father is looking for you. The council meeting is about to begin, and Isabella specifically requested your presence." At 28, Sophia possessed a sharp intellect that often surprised those who underestimated her based on her love of horses and outdoor pursuits. Alexander had always confided in her, but this discovery felt too dangerous to share immediately. He needed to understand the full scope of Isabella's activities before involving anyone else, even his beloved sister. "Tell me, Sophia," Alexander said carefully. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Isabella's behavior recently? Any strange meetings or correspondence?" Sophia tilted her head, considering the question. "Now that you mention it, she has been receiving quite a few private visitors lately. Always in her private chambers, never in the formal receiving rooms. And yesterday, I saw her burning a large stack of letters in her fireplace. I thought it was odd since we're well into spring and hardly need fires for warmth." Alexander's pulse quickened. Isabella was destroying evidence. Whatever operation she was running, she might be preparing to execute the final phase or cover her tracks entirely. "Has she mentioned anything about visiting Astoria soon?" Alexander pressed. "Actually, yes. She suggested to father that she might return to her homeland for a few weeks to settle some affairs related to her late husband's estate." Father seemed supportive of the idea. Sophia's expression grew concerned. "Alexander, what's this about? You look quite pale." Before Alexander could respond, a servant appeared at the door. "Your Highness, His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the council chamber. Queen Isabella and the ministers are waiting." Alexander nodded to the servant, then turned back to Sophia. "We'll speak more later. For now, please keep our conversation private. I may need your help with something very important soon." As they walked through the palace corridors, Alexander's mind continued to race. The council meeting would likely focus on routine matters of state, but he wondered if Isabella had orchestrated his inclusion for a specific reason. Was she suspicious that her activities had been discovered? Or was this simply another step in whatever larger plan she was executing? The council chamber was an imposing room lined with portraits of Valdoria's previous monarchs. King Edmund sat at the head of the long oak table, his graying beard neatly trimmed and his expression serious. Isabella sat to his right, resplendent in a deep blue gown that matched her calculating eyes. Around the table were the kingdom's most trusted advisors, Lord Chancellor Morrison, Treasury Minister Blackwood, and General Hartwell. "Ah, Alexander, please join us," King Edmund said warmly. "We were just discussing the upcoming trade negotiations with the Eastern Kingdoms. Isabella has some valuable insights to share." Alexander took his seat, hyper-aware of Isabella's presence. She smiled at him with what appeared to be genuine warmth, but now he wondered if every expression, every gesture was carefully calculated. "Prince Alexander," Isabella began, her voice smooth and melodious, "I was telling your father that my connections in Astoria could prove invaluable in facilitating these trade discussions. Lord Blackthorne, you remember him from the Winter Festival, has extensive experience in international commerce." The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Lord Blackthorne, the same name from the documents hidden in his pocket. Isabella was boldly introducing her co-conspirator into the kingdom's economic planning, right in front of the king and his advisors. "I'm not familiar with Lord Blackthorne's specific credentials," Alexander said carefully. "Perhaps we should request detailed records of his previous trade agreements before involving him in our negotiations." Isabella's smile never wavered, but Alexander caught a brief flash of something, annoyance, suspicion, in her eyes. "Of course, transparency is always wise in such matters. I'm sure Lord Blackthorne would be happy to provide any documentation you require." Lord Chancellor Morrison leaned forward. "Your Majesty, if I may, the Eastern Kingdoms have been quite selective about their trading partners. Having an experienced intermediary could indeed be beneficial." King Edmund nodded thoughtfully. "Isabella, perhaps you could arrange for this Lord Blackthorne to visit us next week?" "Alexander, and I would like to meet with him personally before making any commitments." "Naturally," Isabella replied. "I'll send word immediately." Alexander watched his stepmother carefully as the meeting continued. She participated in the discussions with apparent genuine interest, offering thoughtful suggestions and asking pertinent questions. If he hadn't seen the evidence with his own eyes, he never would have suspected her of any wrongdoing. She was a masterful actress. As the meeting drew to a close, Isabella turned to King Edmund. "My dear, I've been thinking more about that trip to Astoria I mentioned. With the trade negotiations approaching, it might be wise for me to return sooner rather than later. I could lay important groundwork with Lord Blackthorne and other influential figures." Alexander's blood ran cold. If Isabella left for Astoria now, she might never return. Or worse, she might return with reinforcements to complete whatever plan she had been implementing. "When were you thinking of departing?" King Edmund asked. "Perhaps early next week? I could travel with a small retinue and be back within a fortnight." Alexander knew he had to act quickly. "Father, if I may suggest, perhaps it would be wise to delay any travel until after we've concluded the trade negotiations. Isabella's presence here could prove invaluable during the discussions." Isabella's gaze fixed on Alexander with newfound intensity. "How thoughtful of you, Alexander. Though I do feel that my preliminary work in Astoria could be equally valuable. Surely the kingdom can manage without me for a few weeks." The tension in the room was subtle but palpable. King Edmund looked between his son and wife, sensing an undercurrent he didn't fully understand. "We'll discuss this further tonight," the king decided. "For now, let's adjourn. Alexander, would you join me in my private study? There are some matters regarding your mother's memorial service that require your attention." As the council members filed out, Isabella approached Alexander. "Walk with me to the gardens," she said quietly. "I'd like to discuss your concerns about Lord Blackthorne." Alexander's instincts screamed danger, but refusing would only confirm her suspicions. "Of course, Your Majesty." They walked in silence through the palace corridors and out into the magnificent royal gardens. Isabella led him to a secluded alcove surrounded by blooming roses, where their conversation couldn't be overheard. "You don't trust me," Isabella said without preamble, turning to face him directly. "I can see it in your eyes. The question is, why?" Alexander maintained his composure, though his heart was racing. "I'm naturally cautious about involving outsiders in our kingdom's affairs. Surely you can understand that." Isabella stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Alexander, I've been nothing but loyal to this kingdom and to your father. My every action has been in service to Valdoria's prosperity and security. If you have specific concerns, I'd prefer you voice them directly rather than undermining me in council meetings." "I'm not undermining anyone," Alexander replied evenly. "I'm simply advocating for proper caution in our diplomatic and economic affairs." Isabella studied his face intently, and Alexander felt as though she was trying to peer directly into his thoughts. After a long moment, She stepped back and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Very well. I appreciate your protective instincts regarding the kingdom. They speak well of your character and your fitness to eventually rule. She paused, her expression becoming almost sad. I had hoped that by now, you and I could have developed a closer relationship. I know I can never replace your mother, but I had hoped to at least earn your trust and affection. For a moment, Alexander almost felt guilty. Isabella seemed genuinely hurt by his apparent rejection. But then, he remembered the documents in his pocket, and his resolve hardened. Trust is earned through actions over time, he said diplomatically. I'm sure our relationship will continue to develop naturally. Isabella nodded slowly. Indeed. Actions over time. She looked out over the garden, where gardeners were tending to the spring flowers. I think I'll take my afternoon tea in my chambers today. I have some correspondence to attend to. As she walked away, Alexander noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath the sleeve of her gown, he caught a glimpse of a small dagger strapped to her forearm. Why would the queen need to carry a concealed weapon within the safety of the palace? That evening, Alexander made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer to expose Isabella's treachery, but he also couldn't risk confronting his father without absolute proof. He needed to discover the full extent of her operation and identify all her accomplices within the kingdom. He sent a coded message to Captain Reynolds, the head of his personal guard, and one of the few people he trusted completely. They would need to conduct a careful investigation without alerting Isabella or her potential allies. The documents he had discovered were damning, but they were also 5 years old. He needed current evidence of her ongoing activities. As Alexander prepared for what might be the most dangerous investigation of his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Isabella's request to travel to Astoria, her concealed weapon, and the subtle threats in her conversation all pointed to a plan approaching its climax. The kingdom of Valdoria had weathered many storms throughout its long history, but never before had the threat come from within the royal family itself. Alexander stood at his window once more, looking out over the kingdom he would someday rule, and wondered if there would still be a kingdom left to inherit. In the distance, he could see lights in Isabella's tower chamber, where she was undoubtedly planning her next move. The game between stepmother and stepson had begun in earnest, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The very survival of the kingdom hung in the balance, and only one of them could emerge victorious. As the clock tower chimed midnight, Alexander began to plan his counteroffensive. Tomorrow, he would begin gathering the evidence needed to expose the queen's treachery. But tonight, he would have to sleep knowing that the woman who shared his father's bed was potentially the kingdom's greatest enemy. The shadow behind the crown was about to be illuminated, but whether that light would save or destroy the monarchy remained to be seen. Captain Marcus Reynolds had served the royal family for 15 years, rising through the ranks based on unwavering loyalty and exceptional skill. When he received Prince Alexander's cryptic message requesting a private meeting at dawn in the abandoned watchtower, he knew something serious was unfolding. The prince had never been one for dramatics or unnecessary secrecy. The watchtower stood at the edge of the palace grounds, a relic from more turbulent times when Valdoria faced regular threats from neighboring kingdoms. Now it served as little more than a romantic backdrop for courting couples and a vantage point for spectacular sunrise views. As Reynolds climbed the winding stone stairs, he wondered what could have driven the prince to choose such an isolated meeting place. Alexander was already waiting at the top, silhouetted against the brightening sky. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night, rumpled clothing, disheveled hair, and dark circles under his eyes. In his hands, he held a leather portfolio that he clutched like a lifeline. "Your Highness," Reynolds said quietly, "your message suggested urgency. How may I serve you?" Alexander looked around carefully, ensuring they were truly alone, before speaking. "Marcus, what I'm about to share with you must remain absolutely confidential until we determine the appropriate course of action. The security of the kingdom may depend on it." Reynolds straightened, his military training taking over. "You have my word, Your Highness." Alexander opened the portfolio and withdrew the documents he had discovered. As Reynolds examined them, his expression grew increasingly grave. The captain was a man who had seen combat, political intrigue, and palace scandals, but this evidence clearly shook him. "Good God," Reynolds breathed. "How long has this been going on?" "These documents are 5 years old, dating back to just after Isabella's marriage to my father. But yesterday's events suggest the operation is not only ongoing but may be reaching a critical phase." Alexander recounted his conversation with Isabella in the gardens, her request to travel to Astoria, and the concealed weapon he had glimpsed. Reynolds studied the papers again, his tactical mind already working. The placement of Astorian agents in key positions explains several things that have puzzled me recently. We've had an unusual number of personnel changes in sensitive areas over the past few years. I attributed it to natural turnover, but now I wonder if Isabella has been orchestrating these movements. What kind of changes? 3 new guards assigned to the Treasury building, all with impeccable references from sources I couldn't easily verify. 2 new clerks in the military communications office. A new head of palace security for the East Wing, Isabella's quarters. Reynolds paused, the implications dawning on him. If she has people in all these positions, she has access to our financial records, military communications, and complete control over who enters her private areas. Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She could be smuggling out state secrets, coordinating with outside forces, or even planning something far more sinister. Your Highness, we need to move carefully, but quickly. If Queen Isabella suspects that her activities have been discovered, she might accelerate whatever timeline she's following. Reynolds folded the documents and handed them back to Alexander. What do you want me to do? Alexander had spent most of the night considering their options. I need you to conduct discreet background investigations on all personnel who have been hired or promoted during Isabella's tenure. Focus particularly on those in sensitive positions. But we must be absolutely certain not to alert anyone who might be compromised. That will take time, Your Highness. And if Isabella is planning to leave for Astoria soon, I know. That's why I need you to also assign your most trusted men to monitor Isabella's activities without appearing to do so. I want to know everyone she meets with, every letter she sends, and every conversation she has. Reynolds nodded grimly. I'll put my best people on it immediately. What about informing His Majesty? Alexander had wrestled with this question all night. Not yet. My father loves Isabella deeply, and these accusations will devastate him. We need irrefutable evidence before we destroy his world. Besides, if Isabella has managed to place people throughout the palace, we can't risk the information reaching her before we're ready to act. Understood. I'll begin the investigation today. Reynolds hesitated. Your Highness, if Isabella is planning something immediate, we should consider placing additional security around you and Princess Sophia. If she realizes you're investigating her. The implication hung heavy in the air. Alexander nodded soberly. Do what you can without raising suspicion. And Marcus? Trust no one outside your most carefully vetted team. We don't know how deep this infiltration goes. As they parted ways, Alexander felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders more heavily than ever before. He was no longer just the heir to the throne. He was potentially the only thing standing between his kingdom and a carefully orchestrated downfall. The morning progressed with agonizing normalcy. Alexander attended his regular meetings with various ministers, trying to observe each interaction with new eyes. Was Lord Chancellor Morrison's support for Isabella's trade proposals innocent enthusiasm or something more sinister? When Treasury Minister Blackwood mentioned some irregularities in the accounts that would need Isabella's input to resolve, was he simply doing his job or protecting a co-conspirator? During lunch, Princess Sophia approached Alexander with a troubled expression. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, she said quietly, taking a seat beside him in the family dining room. There's something else you should know about Isabella's recent activities. Alexander set down his fork, giving his sister his full attention. What is it? Last week, I was in the palace library researching bloodline records for my historical project when I overheard Isabella speaking with someone in the next room. She was using a name I didn't recognize, someone called Lady Morgana, and they were discussing something about the rightful succession. Alexander's blood ran cold. The rightful succession? You're certain those were her words? Absolutely. I was curious enough to try to see who she was speaking with, but when I moved closer, the conversation stopped abruptly. When I looked into the room, Isabella was alone, standing by an open window. She claimed she had been practicing a speech for the upcoming charity gala. But you don't believe that? Sophia shook her head. The tone of her voice was completely different from how she usually speaks, more authoritative, almost commanding. And why would she be using a false name to practice a speech? Alexander processed this new information. If Isabella was communicating with someone outside the palace using the name Lady Morgana, it suggested a level of deception and coordination that went beyond what the documents had revealed. And the reference to rightful succession implied that Isabella's goals might extend beyond mere espionage to actually challenging the legitimate royal line. Sophia, I need you to be very careful around Isabella for the time being. Don't let her know that you overheard anything, and try to avoid being alone with her. Sophia's eyes widened. Alexander, you're frightening me. What exactly do you suspect Isabella of doing? Alexander looked around the dining room, noting the servants moving efficiently between the tables. How many of them might be reporting back to Isabella? I can't explain everything right now, but I have reason to believe Isabella may not be the loyal queen consort she appears to be. Until I can gather more evidence, I need you to trust me and be cautious. Before Sophia could respond, Isabella herself entered the dining room, resplendent in an emerald green gown that emphasized her striking beauty. She moved with the grace of someone born to nobility, and her smile seemed to light up the entire room. It was a masterful performance, and Alexander had to admire her skill even as he despised her deception. Good afternoon, my dear family, Isabella said warmly, taking her usual seat across from Alexander. I hope you're both having a pleasant day. Quite pleasant, thank you, Alexander replied carefully. I trust your preparations for the Astoria trip are progressing well. Isabella's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, so briefly that Alexander might have imagined it if he hadn't been watching so intently. Actually, I've been reconsidering the timing. Your father mentioned that he values my input on the upcoming trade negotiations, so perhaps it would be best to postpone my journey until after those are concluded. This was unexpected. Why had Isabella changed her mind about leaving? Had she sensed Alexander's suspicion and decided that fleeing immediately would be too obvious? Or was she confident enough in her position to believe she could complete her objectives from within the palace? How thoughtful of you to put the kingdom's needs first, Alexander said, testing her reaction. I'm sure father will appreciate your dedication. The kingdom's welfare has always been my primary concern, Isabella replied, her eyes meeting Alexander's directly. I believe in protecting what I've come to love, no matter the cost. The words themselves were innocuous, but something in Isabella's tone made them sound almost like a threat. Alexander felt as though they were engaged in a deadly game of chess, with each comment and gesture serving as moves on an invisible board. After lunch, Alexander excused himself to attend to correspondence, but instead made his way to Captain Reynolds' office. He found the captain studying a collection of personnel files with intense concentration. What have you discovered? Alexander asked, closing the door behind him. Reynolds looked up with grim satisfaction. More than I expected, and all of it troubling. Your instincts were correct about the personnel changes. Of the 12 key appointments made since Queen Isabella's arrival, 7 have references that don't fully check out. Not obviously false, but vague enough to be suspicious. And the others? 3 appear completely legitimate, which suggests Isabella was careful not to replace everyone. Smart strategy to avoid detection. The remaining 2 are interesting cases. Reynolds pulled out 2 specific files. These individuals have impeccable credentials and long service records, but both have family members living in Astoria who could potentially be used as leverage. Alexander studied the files. One belonged to Thomas Garrett, a treasury clerk who had access to detailed financial records. The other was Sarah Whitmore, a communications officer in the military command. Both had children living in Astoria with former spouses. So Isabella could be controlling them through threats to their families rather than their loyalty, Alexander concluded. What about the surveillance on Isabella herself? That's where things get very interesting. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. My men observed her receiving a visitor this morning, a man who entered through the servants' entrance rather than the main gate. He was disguised as a tradesman, but his bearings suggested military training. They met in Isabella's private chamber for approximately 30 minutes before he departed the same way he arrived. Did your men recognize him? No, but they managed to follow him to the village, where he met with 2 other individuals at an inn before all 3 departed on horseback toward the Asturian border. Alexander felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She's still in active communication with Astoria. The question is whether this was a routine report or something more urgent. There's more, Your Highness. After the visitor left, Isabella sent for the head of palace security, the man I mentioned who was appointed to oversee her wing of the castle. They spoke privately for nearly an hour. Any idea what they discussed? Reynolds shook his head. But, shortly afterward, I noticed increased security presence around Isabella's quarters. Nothing obvious, but there are definitely more guards than usual positioned in that area. Alexander pondered this development. Was Isabella preparing to defend herself against investigation, or was she positioning herself for some kind of action against the royal family? Marcus, I want you to double the discreet security around Princess Sophia immediately, and arrange for additional protection around my father. But do it in a way that appears routine. Perhaps cite general security concerns rather than specific threats. Already in progress, Your Highness. I've also taken the liberty of having your personal chambers checked for any unusual devices or substances. Nothing suspicious was found, but I'll have them monitored continuously. The fact that Reynolds was taking such precautions without being asked demonstrated the seriousness of the situation. They were operating under the assumption that Isabella might resort to violence to protect her operation or advance her goals. What's our next step? Alexander asked. I recommend we try to intercept Isabella's next communication with her contacts. If we can gather evidence of active collaboration with foreign agents, it will be much easier to convince His Majesty of the threat. Alexander agreed, but privately wondered if they had enough time. Isabella's change of plans regarding the Astoria trip suggested she might be accelerating her timeline rather than abandoning it. If she was confident enough to remain in the palace, it might mean she was preparing for the final phase of whatever operation she had been running. That evening, Alexander joined his father for dinner in the king's private dining chamber. King Edmund seemed unusually contemplative, occasionally glancing toward Isabella's empty chair. She had claimed to be feeling unwell and requested dinner in her chambers. Alexander, the king said quietly, I've been meaning to ask if you've noticed anything unusual about Isabella lately. She seems different somehow, more distant, perhaps even troubled. Alexander's pulse quickened. His father had noticed changes in Isabella's behavior without any prompting. This could be an opportunity to begin preparing him for what was to come. In what way, father? King Edmund set down his wine glass and considered his words carefully. She's always been passionate about her correspondence with friends and relatives in Astoria, but lately it seems to consume much of her time. And she's been asking quite specific questions about kingdom finances and military matters, topics she previously showed little interest in. Perhaps she's simply taking a greater interest in affairs of state, Alexander suggested carefully. You've often said you wished she would become more involved in governance. True, but there's something about the nature of her questions that feels calculated. Yesterday she asked me about our strategic reserves, our defensive capabilities, and our relationships with neighboring kingdoms. When I asked why she was curious about such matters, she claimed it was for a historical essay she was writing. Alexander felt his father was already beginning to suspect something was amiss. What kind of historical essay? Something about the evolution of royal power in the region over the past century. She seemed particularly interested in instances where kingdoms had changed hands through marriage alliances or internal succession disputes. The implications were chilling. Isabella wasn't just gathering intelligence about Valdoria's current state. She was researching historical precedents for taking control of the kingdom. Combined with Sophia's report about the conversation regarding rightful succession, it painted a picture of someone planning a carefully orchestrated coup. Father, Alexander said slowly, if you ever discovered that someone close to you was not who they appeared to be, that they posed a threat to the kingdom, what would you do? King Edmund studied his son's face intently. That's an oddly specific hypothetical question, Alexander. Is there something you need to tell me? Alexander wrestled with his desire to protect his father and his need to gather more concrete evidence. I've simply been thinking about the challenges of leadership and the difficulty of knowing who can truly be trusted. Trust is indeed precious and rare, the king agreed. But it's also essential for effective rule. A monarch who suspects everyone around him becomes paralyzed by doubt. He paused, his expression growing more serious. However, a ruler who trusts blindly becomes vulnerable to betrayal. The key is learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and destructive paranoia. And how does one make that distinction? Evidence, my son. Specific, verifiable evidence. Suspicions and gut feelings have their place, but they must be supported by facts before they can guide action. King Edmund leaned forward. If you ever find yourself in possession of evidence that someone means harm to our family or our kingdom, you must act on it immediately, regardless of personal feelings or consequences. Alexander realized his father was giving him both permission and obligation to pursue the truth about Isabella. Whether the king suspected his wife specifically or was speaking in general terms, he was essentially commanding Alexander to follow the evidence wherever it might lead. I understand, father, and I promise that if I ever discover such evidence, I will bring it to you immediately. King Edmund nodded gravely. See that you do? The crown carries many burdens, but none heavier than the responsibility to protect those who depend on us for their safety and prosperity. As Alexander prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the day's developments. Isabella was accelerating her activities while simultaneously changing her patterns to throw off potential surveillance. His father was beginning to notice her unusual behavior independently, and Captain Reynolds was building a case that grew more damning by the hour. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and possibly new revelations. Alexander had the unsettling feeling that the game of cat and mouse between himself and Isabella was approaching its climax. The question was whether he could gather enough evidence to expose her before she could execute whatever final plan she was orchestrating. As he drifted off to sleep, Alexander's last thought was of the concealed dagger he had seen beneath Isabella's sleeve. In a palace where she was surrounded by loyal guards and protective protocols, why did the queen feel the need to arm herself? The answer, he feared, would soon become all too clear. The morning of the third day brought unexpected developments that would change everything. Alexander was reviewing intelligence reports from Captain Reynolds when a servant arrived with an urgent message from Princess Sophia. She requested his immediate presence in the palace library, claiming to have discovered something of vital importance. Alexander found his sister in the restricted section of the library, surrounded by ancient genealogical records and historical documents. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she looked up from a particularly old manuscript. "Alexander, thank God you're here," Sophia whispered, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I've been researching since dawn, following a lead based on what I overheard yesterday. What I found, it changes everything we thought we knew about Isabella." "What did you discover?" Sophia opened the ancient manuscript to a page filled with intricate family trees and royal seals. "I started investigating the name, Lady Morgana, that Isabella used in her secret conversation. I thought it might be an alias, but it's actually much more significant than that." She pointed to a specific entry in the genealogical record. Lady Morgana was the name of a woman who lived 2 centuries ago. She was the daughter of King Aldric of Astoria and was betrothed to the heir of Valdoria as part of a peace treaty between our kingdoms. But the marriage never took place because the Valdorian prince died in a hunting accident just weeks before the wedding. Alexander studied the entry, beginning to understand the implications. So Lady Morgana never became Queen of Valdoria, despite having a legitimate claim through the betrothal contract. Exactly. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Sophia turned several pages to show a more detailed account. According to these records, Lady Morgana spent the rest of her life claiming that she was the rightful queen of Valdoria and that her descendants should inherit the throne. She even went so far as to style herself Queen in Exile and maintained a shadow court in Astoria. And her descendants? Sophia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's the most shocking part. According to this genealogy, Lady Morgana's bloodline continued in Astoria for several generations. The records become incomplete after about 150 years, but the final entry shows a daughter named Elena who married into the house of Montclair. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Montclair was Isabella's maiden name. Are you suggesting that Isabella is descended from this Lady Morgana? It's more than a suggestion. Look at this. Sophia produced another document, this one more recent. I found this in Mother's personal papers. It's a genealogical study she commissioned shortly after Isabella's engagement to Father. Mother was always thorough about understanding the backgrounds of people who joined our family. Alexander examined the document with growing alarm. It was indeed a detailed genealogical report tracing Isabella's lineage back through several generations. And there, clear as day, was the connection to Lady Morgana and her claim to the Valdorian throne. Mother discovered this and never said anything. I think she was planning to. Look at the date on the report. It was completed just 2 weeks before her accident. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Alexander, what if Mother's death wasn't an accident at all? What if Isabella discovered that Mother had uncovered her true identity and heritage? The possibility hit Alexander like a physical blow. Their mother's riding accident had always seemed strange. She was an expert horsewoman who knew every trail on the estate. But if Isabella had somehow orchestrated the accident to prevent the discovery of her true agenda, we need to be very careful with these documents, Alexander said grimly. If you're right about Mother's death, then Isabella is capable of far more than espionage or financial manipulation. She's willing to commit murder to achieve her goals. There's more. Sophia continued. I've been thinking about the timing of everything. Isabella appeared in our kingdom and captured father's attention very quickly after mother's death, almost as if she had been waiting for the opportunity. Alexander's mind raced through the implications. If Isabella truly believed herself to be the rightful heir to Valdoria through her ancestors' ancient claim, then everything made sense. The infiltration of the government, the financial manipulations, the communication with Astoria, it wasn't just espionage. It was preparation for a restoration that she believed was her birthright. We need to get this information to Captain Reynolds immediately, Alexander said. But first, help me understand the legal implications. Does this ancient betrothal contract actually give Isabella any legitimate claim to the throne? Sophia shook her head. Not under modern succession laws. The betrothal was dissolved when the prince died, and even if it hadn't been, inheritance through an uncompleted marriage alliance would never be recognized today. But Isabella might not see it that way, especially if she's been raised believing in her family's claim to royal status. Which means she's essentially planning a coup based on a delusion of legitimacy. Exactly. And if she's managed to place enough loyal supporters in key positions throughout the kingdom, she might actually have a chance of succeeding. Alexander carefully gathered the documents. Sophia, I need you to stay away from Isabella completely until this is resolved. If she realizes what we've discovered, your life could be in immediate danger. I'm not leaving you to face this alone, Sophia said firmly. Besides, I might be able to help. Isabella still seems to trust me, or at least sees me as harmless. I could potentially gather information that you and Captain Reynolds couldn't access. Absolutely not. If Isabella killed our mother to protect her secret, she won't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who threatens her plans. Before Sophia could argue further, they heard footsteps approaching the library. Both siblings quickly concealed the documents as Lord Chancellor Morrison appeared, looking unusually flustered. Your Highnesses, forgive the intrusion, but I'm afraid there's been an urgent development. Queen Isabella has collapsed in her chambers, and the royal physician has been summoned. Alexander and Sophia exchanged glances. Was Isabella genuinely ill, or was this some kind of manipulation to throw off suspicion or gain sympathy? What are the circumstances of her collapse? Alexander asked. Her lady-in-waiting found her unconscious this morning when she went to assist with dressing for the day. The queen appeared to be in some distress, though she was conscious when the physician arrived. Has father been informed? His Majesty is with her now? The physician believes it may be a case of nervous exhaustion, brought on by the stress of her various royal duties. Alexander highly doubted that Isabella's collapse was due to stress from royal duties, particularly since those duties were largely ceremonial. More likely, she was either genuinely ill due to the pressure of maintaining her deception, or she was staging the entire incident for strategic purposes. We should go to her immediately, Sophia said, playing her part perfectly. As they made their way through the palace corridors, Alexander's mind worked furiously. If Isabella was staging her illness, what could she hope to gain from it? Sympathy from the king? An excuse to avoid questions about her recent behavior? Or perhaps a reason to accelerate whatever timeline she was following? They found King Edmund pacing outside Isabella's chamber while the royal physician completed his examination. The king's face showed genuine concern and worry, confirming that he had no awareness of Isabella's true nature or agenda. How is she, father? Sophia asked, placing a comforting hand on the king's arm. Dr. Pemberton says she's stable, but needs complete rest. He suspects she's been under more strain than she's been willing to admit. King Edmund turned to Alexander. She's been asking for you specifically. She says there's something important she needs to discuss with you. Alexander felt a chill of apprehension. Why would Isabella want to see him specifically? Had she somehow discovered his investigation? Was this an attempt to determine how much he knew? Did she say what she wanted to discuss? Something about her upcoming trip to Astoria. She seemed quite agitated about ensuring certain arrangements were made properly. Dr. Pemberton emerged from the chamber, closing the door quietly behind him. He was an elderly man who had served the royal family for decades, and his expression was thoughtfully concerned. Your Majesty, Her Majesty is conscious and coherent, but I'm concerned about her state of mind as well as her physical condition. She seems to be experiencing some kind of internal conflict or anxiety that goes beyond normal stress. What do you recommend? King Edmund asked. Complete rest for at least several days, minimal visitors, and perhaps a consultation with someone who specializes in nervous disorders if her condition doesn't improve. Alexander realized this could actually work to their advantage. If Isabella was confined to her chambers under medical supervision, it would limit her ability to communicate with her confederates or execute any immediate plans. Perhaps her trip to Astoria should be postponed indefinitely, Alexander suggested. Clearly, she's not in any condition to travel. I had the same thought, King Edmund agreed. Isabella won't be happy about the delay, but her health must take priority. Dr. Pemberton nodded approvingly. Travel would be absolutely contraindicated in her current state. In fact, I would recommend limiting all stressful activities, including state functions and formal audiences. This was even better than Alexander had hoped. Isabella would essentially be under house arrest, albeit for medical rather than criminal reasons. It would give him time to complete his investigation and gather the evidence needed to expose her fully. Your Majesty, Dr. Pemberton continued, Queen Isabella is quite insistent about speaking with Prince Alexander. She claims it's a matter of some urgency related to kingdom business. I would normally recommend against any such meetings, but she became quite agitated when I suggested postponing the conversation. King Edmund looked to Alexander. Would you be willing to speak with her briefly? Perhaps it would ease her mind and aid in her recovery. Alexander had no choice but to agree, though every instinct warned him that this could be dangerous. Of course, father. But perhaps Dr. Pemberton should remain nearby in case the conversation becomes too taxing for Isabella. An excellent precaution, the doctor agreed. Alexander entered Isabella's chamber with great caution. The room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn to create an atmosphere of sickroom gloom. Isabella lay in her bed, pale and seemingly fragile, but her eyes were alert and calculating. Alexander, she said softly, gesturing for him to approach. Thank you for coming. I know you must think me terribly weak to collapse like this. Not at all. Everyone faces periods of strain and difficulty. Isabella studied his face intently. Yes, strain can be overwhelming, especially when one is carrying burdens that others don't understand or appreciate. Alexander felt as though they were speaking in code, each trying to determine how much the other knew without revealing their own hand. Is there something specific troubling you that I might be able to help with? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Alexander, do you believe that people should fight for what they believe is rightfully theirs, even when others might not understand or support their claim? The question sent chills down Alexander's spine. Was Isabella testing whether he knew about her ancestral claim to the throne? Or was she preparing to reveal her true identity and intentions? I believe that legitimate rights should be respected, Alexander said carefully. But that claim should be based on law and justice rather than personal belief or ancient grievances. Isabella's expression shifted subtly, and Alexander caught a glimpse of something harder and more determined beneath her facade of fragility. How wise of you to emphasize legitimacy and justice. But, tell me, what happens when the law itself is based on historical injustices? When those who rule do so only because past wrongs were never corrected? Alexander realized that Isabella was essentially confessing her entire worldview. She genuinely believed that the current royal family of Valdoria were usurpers, and that she was the rightful heir based on her ancestors' ancient betrothal contract. Historical injustices are tragic, Alexander replied, but attempting to correct them centuries later often creates new injustices rather than resolving old ones. Sometimes the most ethical path is to accept the present reality and work within it for positive change. Isabella's facade dropped completely for just a moment, and Alexander saw raw fury in her eyes before she regained control. How comfortably those in power speak of accepting reality and working within existing systems. But what of those who have been denied their birthright for generations? Isabella, Alexander said gently, are you feeling well enough for this conversation? You seem to be becoming agitated, and Dr. Pemberton was very concerned about your need for rest. Isabella seemed to remember where she was and what she was supposed to be doing. The mask of frailty slipped back into place, but Alexander had seen enough to confirm his worst fears. Isabella wasn't just a spy or even a would-be usurper. She was a true believer who saw herself as a righteous claimant to a stolen throne. You're right, of course. I'm afraid my illness has made me somewhat philosophical and melancholy. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time? Certainly. Focus on your recovery, and try not to worry about kingdom business. Everything will be managed appropriately in your absence. As Alexander prepared to leave, Isabella spoke once more. Alexander, I want you to know that whatever happens in the coming days, my actions have always been motivated by what I believe is right and just. I hope someday you'll understand that. Alexander felt as though he had just received both a confession and a warning. Isabella was preparing for some kind of action, and she wanted him to know that she saw herself as justified in whatever she was planning to do. I hope you feel better soon, Isabella. Rest well. As Alexander left the chamber, he knew that time was running out. Isabella's collapse might have been genuine after all. The strain of maintaining her deception while preparing for what she saw as the restoration of her rightful inheritance could indeed have overwhelmed her. But it had also shown him that she was far more dangerous than he had initially realized. She wasn't just planning to betray Valdoria to Astoria. She was planning to claim the throne for herself, and she genuinely believed she had every right to do so. The conversation had been her way of testing whether he knew the truth and possibly recruiting him to her cause. Alexander found Captain Reynolds waiting in the corridor outside, his expression grim. "Your Highness, we need to speak immediately. There have been developments that can't wait." As they walked quickly toward Reynolds' office, Alexander wondered if his investigation had uncovered new evidence, just as Isabella's own timeline was accelerating. The next few hours could determine the fate of the kingdom, and Alexander had the sinking feeling that the final confrontation was approaching far more quickly than anyone was prepared for. Captain Reynolds' office had been transformed into a makeshift command center. Maps of the palace and surrounding grounds covered every surface. Personnel files were stacked in precise arrangements, and a detailed timeline of Isabella's activities stretched across one entire wall. When Alexander arrived, he found Reynolds and 3 of his most trusted officers deep in discussion. "Your Highness," Reynolds said urgently, "our surveillance has uncovered something that changes everything." Isabella's collapse this morning was not genuine. It was a deliberate distraction to cover a massive mobilization of her supporters throughout the kingdom. Alexander felt his blood run cold. What kind of mobilization? One of Reynolds' officers, Lieutenant Hayes, stepped forward with a detailed report. While everyone was focused on Queen Isabella's medical emergency, we observed coordinated movement of personnel throughout the palace and the capital city. At least a dozen individuals we've identified as potential Astorian agents have taken up positions at strategic locations. Reynolds pointed to the map of the palace. "Look at this pattern. They've positioned people at the treasury, the communications center, the main armory, and all primary entrances to the royal quarters. This isn't preparation for espionage. It's preparation for a takeover." "There's more," Lieutenant Hayes continued. "Our contacts in the capital report that approximately 50 armed men, all claiming to be legitimate traders from Astoria, arrived in the city over the past 3 days. They've been staying at different inns and maintaining low profiles, but our sources confirm they're all military trained." Alexander studied the tactical assessment with growing alarm. 50 armed men, plus the agents already embedded in the palace. That's enough to secure key locations and potentially overwhelm our regular security forces if they achieve the element of surprise. "It gets worse," Reynolds said grimly. "We intercepted a coded message that was delivered to Isabella's chamber during her supposed medical emergency. Our cryptographer worked through the night to decode it." Reynolds handed Alexander a transcript of the decoded message. As Alexander read it, he felt the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Phase 3 authorized. Royal family to be secured at dawn tomorrow. Succession announcement to follow immediately. Long live the rightful Queen of Valdoria. Astoria stands ready to provide recognition and support. Alexander looked up from the message, his face pale. "She's planning to execute a coup tomorrow morning. Royal family to be secured likely means taken into custody or worse." "There's one more critical piece of information," Reynolds continued. "Our investigation into Isabella's background confirmed Princess Sophia's genealogical research. Isabella is indeed descended from Lady Morgana, and she's been raised from childhood believing in her family's claim to the Valdorian throne. But we also discovered something else. She's not acting alone." Reynolds produced another file, thick with intelligence reports and intercepted communications. "Isabella has the full backing of a faction within the Astorian nobility who see this as an opportunity to bring Valdoria under Astorian influence. They've been planning this operation for years, possibly since before your mother's death." The implication was staggering. This wasn't just a personal vendetta or delusion of grandeur. It was a carefully orchestrated international conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate government of Valdoria. "What about my father? Does he know about any of this?" "No, Your Highness. As far as we can determine, His Majesty remains completely unaware of the threat. And that may be intentional. Isabella likely wants to present the coup as a fait accompli rather than give him time to organize resistance. Alexander made a decision that would change the course of history for Valdoria. We're going to stop her tonight, before she can implement her plan. Your Highness, Reynolds said carefully, that's an extremely risky course of action. We're dealing with a well-coordinated conspiracy with significant resources. If we move too soon or without sufficient preparation, we could precipitate the very crisis we're trying to prevent. And if we wait until tomorrow morning, Isabella's supporters will be in position to seize control of the kingdom before we can react effectively. Alexander began pacing, his tactical instincts taking over. What are our advantages? Lieutenant Hayes consulted his notes. We know their positions and their timeline, which they don't realize. We have loyal forces that haven't been compromised. And we have the element of surprise. They believe their deception is still intact. What about personnel? How many completely reliable soldiers can we mobilize immediately? Reynolds considered the question carefully. 43 men whose loyalty I can guarantee without reservation. Probably another 20 who are likely loyal, but haven't been thoroughly vetted for this level of security. So we're essentially evenly matched in terms of numbers. But we have the advantage of knowing the palace layout better than Isabella's foreign agents. Correct. But, Your Highness, there's another consideration. Even if we successfully stop Isabella's coup, the political ramifications will be enormous. We'll be arresting the queen consort and potentially engaging in armed conflict within the palace itself. That kind of upheaval could destabilize the kingdom regardless of the outcome. Alexander understood the gravity of the situation, but he also recognized that they had no choice. The alternative is allowing Isabella to overthrow the legitimate government and potentially harm or eliminate members of the royal family. We have to act. What about informing His Majesty before we proceed? Alexander wrestled with this decision. His father deserved to know the truth, but revealing everything now could compromise their ability to act effectively. If King Edmund confronted Isabella before they were ready to move, it could trigger her supporters to implement their plan immediately. We'll inform Father once we have Isabella and her primary supporters in custody. Until then, the risk of premature exposure is too great. Reynolds nodded grimly. What are your orders, Your Highness? Alexander looked at the maps and intelligence reports spread before him, feeling the weight of command settling on his shoulders. We coordinate simultaneous operations to neutralize Isabella's key supporters before moving against Isabella herself. The goal is to prevent any communication between the conspirators and minimize the chance of armed resistance. And if they do resist, we use whatever force is necessary to protect the kingdom and the royal family. But we make every effort to take prisoners rather than casualties. We'll need them to provide testimony about the full scope of the conspiracy. Over the next several hours, Alexander and Reynolds planned one of the most complex security operations in Valdoria's history. They divided their loyal forces into several teams, each assigned to simultaneously secure key locations and arrest specific conspirators. The operation would begin at midnight, giving them a 6-hour window to complete their objectives before Isabella's planned dawn coup. As the hour approached, Alexander made his way to Princess Sophia's chambers to ensure her safety during the operation. He found her waiting for him, fully dressed despite the late hour. I know what's happening, she said before he could speak. Captain Reynolds briefed me on the situation. I want to help. Absolutely not. You're staying in your chambers under heavy guard until this is over. Alexander, listen to me. Isabella still trusts me, or at least doesn't see me as a threat. If something goes wrong with your operation, I might be the only person who can get close enough to her to prevent something terrible from happening. That's exactly why you're staying here. If Isabella is desperate enough to stage a coup, she's desperate enough to harm anyone she perceives as an obstacle. Sophia placed her hands on Alexander's shoulders, her expression serious. Our mother died because someone was willing to commit murder for power. I won't hide in safety while you risk your life to protect the kingdom. We're in this together. Alexander looked at his sister's determined face and realized that she had inherited the same sense of duty and courage that had driven their mother to investigate Isabella in the first place. But he also couldn't bear the thought of losing her. If you insist on being involved, you'll stay with Captain Reynolds' command team, where you'll be protected by our best soldiers. And if I give you an order during the operation, you'll follow it without question. Agreed. As midnight approached, Alexander positioned himself with the team assigned to arrest Isabella. They had decided to begin with her since she was the central coordinator of the conspiracy. If they could take her into custody quickly and quietly, it would significantly complicate the efforts of her supporters. The approach to Isabella's chambers was carefully planned to avoid the guards she had positioned. Reynolds had identified a service corridor that would allow them to bypass the normal security checkpoints and enter her private quarters without alerting her supporters. Alexander wore full combat gear for the first time in his life, feeling the weight of armor and weapons that he had trained with but never expected to use in actual conflict. As they moved through the darkened corridors of the palace he had called home his entire life, he reflected on how surreal it was to be conducting a military operation against his own stepmother. The service corridor was narrow and dimly lit, forcing the team to move in single file. Alexander could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears as they approached the hidden entrance to Isabella's private chambers. Everything depended on maintaining the element of surprise. Reynolds signaled for the team to halt just outside the concealed door. Through the thin walls, they could hear voices. Isabella was not alone in her chambers. The presence of additional people complicated their plans significantly. Using hand signals, Reynolds indicated that he could identify at least 3 distinct voices, Isabella and 2 others, likely the military advisor she had been meeting with throughout her operation. Alexander made a quick decision. They would proceed with the arrest despite the additional personnel. Reynolds carefully opened the concealed door, revealing Isabella's private sitting room. Isabella stood at a table covered with maps and documents, in deep conversation with 2 men in dark clothing who were clearly not palace staff. All 3 were so focused on their planning that they didn't immediately notice the door opening. "Queen Isabella," Alexander said quietly but firmly, "by order of the crown, you are under arrest for high treason and conspiracy against the kingdom of Valdoria." The reaction was immediate and violent. One of Isabella's companions drew a sword and lunged toward Alexander, while the other moved to a window, as if to signal supporters outside. Isabella herself reached for something hidden beneath the papers on her table. Reynolds and his men reacted with professional efficiency, subduing Isabella's companions before either could complete their actions. But Isabella proved to be more formidable than anyone had expected. The object she had reached for was indeed a weapon, not the small dagger Alexander had glimpsed before, but a fully functional crossbow that she clearly knew how to use. "Stop where you are," Isabella commanded, her voice carrying an authority that Alexander had never heard before. Gone was any pretense of fragility or deference. This was the voice of someone who had been trained to command and expected to be obeyed. "Isabella, there's nowhere to run. We know about your entire operation. Surrender now, and this can be resolved without bloodshed." Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Resolved? Alexander, this was resolved 2 centuries ago when Lady Morgana was denied her rightful place as Queen of Valdoria. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to reclaim what belongs to my family. Your ancestors' betrothal contract has no legal standing under modern succession law. You must know that." "Legal standing?" Isabella's eyes blazed with fanatical certainty. "The law was written by usurpers to legitimize their theft of my family's birthright. I don't recognize the authority of thieves to determine what is legal." Alexander realized that reasoning with Isabella was impossible. She had been raised with such complete conviction in her family's grievances that she was immune to logical arguments about legal precedent or political reality. "Isabella, think about what you're doing. Even if you somehow managed to seize control of Valdoria, do you really think the other kingdoms would recognize your authority? You'd be creating a civil war that would destroy everything you claim to want to protect. The kingdom of Astoria will recognize my claim immediately, and others will follow. Once the truth about the historical injustice is revealed, the righteous will support the restoration of the legitimate royal line." As Isabella spoke, Alexander could hear sounds of conflict echoing from other parts of the palace. Reynolds' other teams were encountering resistance from Isabella's supporters, and the coup attempt was becoming a full-scale battle for control of the kingdom. Isabella heard the same sounds and smiled grimly. "It's too late to stop what's already begun, Alexander. By dawn, the rightful order will be restored to Valdoria, whether you cooperate or not." "The only thing that will be restored is justice," Alexander replied. "Your conspiracy ends tonight." As Alexander spoke those words, he heard his father's voice echoing through the palace corridors. King Edmund was awake and aware that something was happening. The confrontation that Alexander had hoped to delay until Isabella was safely in custody was about to begin with the kingdom's fate hanging in the balance. The hour of truth had arrived for Valdoria, and only one vision of the kingdom's future would survive the night. The sound of King Edmund's voice calling through the palace corridors created a moment of tension that seemed to stretch into eternity. Isabella's crossbow remained trained on Alexander, while Captain Reynolds and his men held their weapons ready but dared not fire with their prince in the line of danger. Through the windows, the sounds of combat echoed from the palace grounds as loyal forces engaged Isabella's planted supporters. "Your father approaches," Isabella said with cold satisfaction. Perfect timing. He should witness the moment when justice finally returns to Valdoria. "Isabella, please," Alexander said urgently. "Whatever grievances your family may have harbored, this isn't the way to resolve them. You're about to destroy two kingdoms with your actions. Sometimes destruction is necessary to clear the ground for proper reconstruction." Isabella's voice carried an eerie calm that was more frightening than any display of emotion would have been. Lady Morgana understood that when she accepted exile rather than submit to the usurpers, she knew that someday her bloodline would return to claim what was stolen. The door to Isabella's chambers burst open as King Edmund appeared, flanked by 4 palace guards. His face showed a mixture of confusion, alarm, and growing realization as he took in the scene before him. His son in armor, soldiers in his wife's chambers, and Isabella herself holding a weapon. "What in God's name is happening here?" King Edmund demanded. "Alexander, why are there armed men in the palace? Isabella, why are you holding a crossbow?" Isabella turned to face her husband, and, for a moment, her expression softened with what might have been genuine regret. "My dear Edmund, I had hoped to spare you the pain of witnessing this moment. But perhaps it's better that you understand the truth before the new order begins." "The truth about what?" "Isabella, you're frightening me. Put down that weapon and explain what's happening." Alexander saw his opportunity. While Isabella was focused on his father, he might be able to move close enough to disarm her. But, as he shifted slightly, Isabella's attention snapped back to him immediately. "Don't even think about it, Alexander. I've been trained in combat since childhood, something your soft palace life never prepared you for." King Edmund stepped closer, his confusion giving way to growing alarm. "Trained in combat? Isabella, what are you talking about? You're a widow from Astoria, not a warrior." "I'm the rightful queen of Valdoria," Isabella declared, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "I am the great-great-granddaughter of Lady Morgana, who was betrothed to your ancestor Prince Marcus before his convenient death prevented the union that would have united our kingdoms under the legitimate royal bloodline." The color drained from King Edmund's face as he processed this revelation. "You're claiming royal heritage based on an ancient betrothal contract." "Not claiming, asserting. The contract was never legally dissolved because Prince Marcus died before it could be completed. Lady Morgana remained the rightful queen of Valdoria until her death, and her claim passed to her descendants." Isabella's eyes blazed with fanatic certainty. "For 2 centuries, my family has been denied our birthright. That injustice ends tonight." King Edmund looked at his son, beginning to understand the scope of what was unfolding. "Alexander, how long have you known about this?" "I discovered evidence of Isabella's true activities and agenda 3 days ago, father. We've been investigating the full extent of her conspiracy since then." "Conspiracy?" King Edmund's voice carried a note of heartbreak. "Isabella, tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. Tell me you haven't been deceiving me throughout our entire marriage." Isabella's expression softened momentarily, and Alexander caught a glimpse of the woman who had genuinely seemed to love his father. "Edmund, my feelings for you were real. That was never part of the plan. But my duty to my family's legacy had to take precedence over personal desires. Your duty to your family's legacy included infiltrating my kingdom, placing foreign agents in sensitive positions, and apparently planning to overthrow my government. I prefer to think of it as reclaiming stolen property and restoring rightful authority." Isabella's voice hardened again. "But, yes, if you insist on viewing it through the lens of current political structures, then I have indeed been working to overthrow what I consider to be an illegitimate government." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Princess Sophia appeared in the doorway, flanked by more of Captain Reynolds' men. Her face was flushed and her clothes disheveled, suggesting she had been involved in the conflict despite Alexander's attempts to keep her safe. "Alexander, the Treasury building is secure, but there are still pockets of resistance in the East Wing," she reported breathlessly. Then, she saw Isabella with the crossbow, and Her expression changed to one of alarm. What's happening here? Your stepmother has just revealed that she's been conducting a years-long operation to overthrow our government based on her belief that she's the rightful heir to Valdoria's throne, Alexander explained grimly. Sophia's eyes widened as she processed this information. The genealogical research I found. You're really descended from Lady Morgana? I'm not just descended from her, Isabella corrected with pride. I am her rightful heir, and, through her, the true queen of Valdoria. King Edmund seemed to age years in the span of moments as the full scope of Isabella's deception became clear. Our entire marriage was built on lies. Everything you said, everything you did, it was all in service of this delusion. It wasn't a delusion, and it wasn't entirely lies, Isabella said with a note of defensiveness. My feelings for you were genuine, Edmund. But love cannot take precedence over justice. Justice? King Edmund's voice rose with anger. You call infiltrating my kingdom, corrupting my officials, and planning to overthrow my government justice? I call restoring the rightful royal line to power justice, yes. Alexander realized that the standoff could continue indefinitely unless someone took decisive action. Isabella was too well-trained and too fanatically committed to her cause to surrender willingly. And, with each moment that passed, more of her supporters might rally to continue the fight even if she was captured. Isabella, Alexander said carefully, what exactly did you plan to do with my family once you seized power? The message we intercepted mentioned that the royal family was to be secured. Isabella hesitated, and Alexander caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. That was never fully decided. The plan was to present the truth about the legitimate succession and allow the people of Valdoria to choose their rightful ruler. By force of arms, and with foreign soldiers occupying strategic locations, sometimes people need guidance to make the right choices. Princess Sophia stepped forward, her voice surprisingly calm given the circumstances. Isabella, even if we accepted your interpretation of the historical events, which we don't, you must realize that your methods have destroyed any chance of legitimate support. No kingdom accepts rulers who seize power through deception and violence. The methods were necessary because the usurpers would never willingly relinquish stolen power, Isabella replied. But once the truth is revealed and the rightful order is restored, the people will understand and accept the new reality. King Edmund shook his head sadly. Isabella, do you really believe that the people of Valdoria would accept as their queen someone who betrayed their trust, infiltrated their government with foreign agents, and attempted to overthrow their lawful ruler through violence? For the first time since the confrontation began, Isabella's absolute certainty seemed to waver. They will understand once they know the full history. Once they realize that justice requires the restoration of the legitimate bloodline. The only thing they'll understand is that you're a traitor who nearly destroyed their kingdom for personal ambition disguised as historical grievance, Alexander said firmly. The sound of running footsteps approached, and Captain Reynolds appeared in the doorway. Your Highness, we've successfully secured all key locations. Isabella's supporters are either in custody or have fled the kingdom. The immediate threat to the palace has been neutralized. Isabella's face went pale as she realized that her carefully planned operation had failed. The coup that was supposed to restore her family's rightful place in history had crumbled in a matter of hours. It's over, Isabella, Alexander said gently. Your supporters are defeated, your conspiracy has been exposed, and your claim to the throne has been rejected. Please, put down the weapon and surrender peacefully. Isabella looked around the room at the faces of the royal family she had lived with for 5 years. King Edmund, whose love she had genuinely cherished even as she planned to betray him. Alexander, whose suspicion and investigation had ultimately unraveled her plans. Sophia, whose research had helped confirm the truth about Isabella's heritage and intentions. You don't understand, Isabella said quietly, her voice carrying a note of despair. I've spent my entire life preparing for this moment. My family raised me believing that restoring our rightful claim to Valdoria was my sacred duty. Without that purpose, I have nothing. You could have had a life, King Edmund said with profound sadness. We could have had a real marriage, built on truth instead of deception. You could have been a beloved queen consort, remembered for your contributions to the kingdom's prosperity rather than your attempts to destroy it. A beloved queen consort to the descendants of usurpers? How could I find honor or satisfaction in legitimizing the very injustice my family has fought against for generations? Alexander realized that Isabella's commitment to her cause went beyond political ambition or personal gain. She had been psychologically conditioned from childhood to see herself as a righteous avenger rather than a treacherous infiltrator. In her mind, everything she had done was morally justified by the historical grievances of her family. Isabella, Alexander said with genuine compassion, I understand that you believe your cause is just, but surely you can see that your methods have caused more suffering than they could ever remedy. How many people have died tonight because of this conspiracy? How many families will be torn apart by the consequences of what you've done? Isabella's hands began to tremble as the full weight of her failure settled upon her. The price of justice is always high. Lady Morgana understood that when she chose exile over submission. The price of vengeance is even higher, Princess Sophia observed quietly. And that's what this really was, isn't it? Not justice, but revenge for a grievance that happened before any of us were born. Isabella's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face as she grappled with the collapse of everything she had worked toward. You don't understand what it's like to grow up knowing that your family was denied its rightful place in the world. To be raised with the knowledge that you are the descendant of royalty, but forced to live as a commoner because of historical injustice. I understand the pain of loss and the desire for justice, King Edmund said gently. But I also understand that some wounds can't be healed by creating new ones. Isabella looked at the crossbow in her hands as if seeing it for the first time. Slowly, she lowered the weapon and set it on the table beside her. I surrender, she said quietly. Not because I believe your rule is legitimate, but because I can see that my mission has failed. Captain Reynolds and his men moved quickly to secure Isabella, though she offered no resistance. As the restraints were placed on her wrists, she looked at King Edmund with an expression of profound sadness. Edmund, despite everything else, I want you to know that my love for you is real. It was the one thing about this entire operation that wasn't calculated or strategic. King Edmund nodded, his own eyes filled with tears. I believe you, Isabella. And that makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking.